When I reached C Company lines, which were at the top of the hill, I paused and looked back at the camp, just coming into full view below me, through the grey mist of early morning. We were leaving that day. When we marched in, 3 months before, the place was under new snow. Now the first leaves of spring were unfolding. I had reflected then that, whatever the scenes of desolation lay ahead of us, I never feared one more brutal than this, and I reflected now that it had no single happy memory for me. Here, love had died between me and the army. Here the tram lines ended, so that men returning fuddled from Glasgow could doze in their seats until roused by the conductress at their journey's end. There was some way to go from the tram stop to the camp gates, a quarter of a mile in which they could button their blouses and straighten their caps before passing the guard-room, a quarter of a mile in which concrete gave place to grass at the road's edge. This was the extreme limit of the city, a fringe of driftwood above the high water mark. Here the close homogeneous territory of housing estates and cinemas ended, and the hinterland began. The camp stood where, until quite lately, had been pasture and ploughland. The farmhouse stood in a fold of the hill, and had served us for a battalion office. Ivy still supported part of what had once been the walls of a fruit garden. Half an acre of mutilated old trees behind the wash-houses survived of an orchard. The place had been marked for destruction before the army came to it. Had there been another year of peace, there would have been no farmhouse, no wall, no apple trees. Already, half a mile of concrete lay between the bare clay banks, and on either side a checker of open ditches showed where the municipal contractors had designed a system of drainage. Another year of peace would have made the place part of a neighboring suburb. Now the huts where we had wintered waited their turn for destruction. Over the way, the subject of much ironical comment, half hidden, even in winter, by its embosoming trees, lay the municipal lunatic asylum, whose cast-iron railings and noble gates put our rough wire to shame. We could watch the madmen, on clement days, sauntering and skipping among the trim gravel walks and pleasantly planted lawns. Happy collaborationists who had given up the unequal struggle, all doubts resolved, all duty done, the undisputed heirs-at-law of a century of progress, enjoying the heritage at their ease. As we marched past, the men used to shout greetings to them through the railings. "Keep a bed warm for me, chum. I shan't be long." But Hooper, my newest joined platoon commander, grudged them their life of privilege. "Hitler would put them in a gas chamber," he said. "I reckon we can learn a thing or two from him." Here, when we marched in at midwinter, I brought a company of strong and hopeful men. Word had gone round among them, as we moved from the moors to the Dockland area, that we were at last in transit for the Middle East. As the days passed and we began clearing the snow and levelling a parade ground, I saw their disappointment change to resignation. They snuffed the smell of fried fish shops and cocked their ears to the familiar peacetime sounds of the works siren and the dance-hall band. On off days, they slouched now at street corners and sidled away at the approach of an officer, for fear that, by saluting, they would lose face with their new mistresses. In the company office was a crop of minor changes and requests for compassionate leave. While it was still half light, day began, with the whine and malingerer, and the glum face and fixed eye of a man with a grievance. And I, who by every precept should have put heart into them, how could I help them, who could so little help myself? Here the colonel under whom we had formed was promoted out of our sight, and succeeded by a younger and less lovable man, cross-posted from another regiment. There were few left in the mess now that the batch of volunteers who trained together at the outbreak of war. One way and another, they were all nearly gone. Some had been invalided out, some promoted to other battalions, some posted to staff jobs, some had volunteered for special service. One had got himself killed on the field firing range. One had been court-martialed, and their places were taken by conscripts. The wireless played incessantly in the anteroom nowadays. Much beer was drunk before dinner. It was not as it had been. Here, at the age of 39, I began to be old. I felt stiff and weary in the evenings, and reluctant to go out of camp. I developed proprietary claims to certain chairs and newspapers. I regularly drank 3 glasses of gin before dinner, never more or less, and went to bed immediately after the 9 o'clock news. I was always awake and fretful an hour before Reveille. Here my last love died. There was nothing remarkable in the manner of its death. One day, not long before this last day in camp, as I lay awake before Reveille, in the Nissen hut, gazing into the complete blackness, amid the deep breathing and muttering of the other 4 occupants, turning over in my mind what I had to do that day. Had I put in the names of the 2 corporals for the weapons training course? Should I again have the largest number of men overstaying their leave in the batch due back that day? Could I trust Hooper to take the candidates out map reading? As I lay in that dark hour, I was aghast to realize that something within me, long sickening, had quietly died, and felt as a husband might feel, who in the 4th year of his marriage suddenly knew that he no longer had any desire or tenderness or esteem for a once beloved wife, no pleasure in her company, no wish to please, no curiosity about anything she might ever do or say or think, no hope of setting things right, no self-reproach for the disaster. I knew it all, the whole drab compass of marital disillusion. We had been through it together, the army and I, from the first importune courtship until now, when nothing remained to us except the chill bonds of law and duty and custom. I had played every scene in the domestic tragedy, had found in the early tiffs more frequent, and the tears less affecting, the reconciliations less sweet, till they engendered a mood of aloofness and cool criticism, and the growing conviction that it was not myself but the loved one who was at fault. I caught the false notes in her voice, and learned to listen for them apprehensively. I recognized the blank, resentful stare of incomprehension in her eyes, and the selfish, hard set of the corners of her mouth. I learned her, as one must learn a woman one has kept house with, day in and day out, for 3.5 years. I learned her slatternly ways, the routine and mechanism of her charm, her jealousy and self-seeking, her nervous trick with the fingers when she was lying. She was stripped of all enchantment now, and I knew her for an uncongenial stranger, to whom I had bound myself indissolubly in a moment of folly. So on this morning of our move, I was entirely indifferent as to our destination. I would go on with my job, but I could bring to it nothing more than acquiescence. Our orders were to entrain at 09:15 at a nearby siding, taking in the haversack the unexpired portion of the day's ration. That was all I needed to know. The company second in command had gone on with a small advance party. Company stores had been packed the day before. Hooper had been detailed to inspect the line. The company was parading at 07:30, with their kit bags piled before the huts. There had been many such moves since the wildly exhilarating morning in 1940, when we had erroneously believed ourselves to be destined for the defense of Calais. 3 or 4 times a year since then we had changed our location. This time our new commanding officer was making an unusual display of security, and had even put us to the trouble of removing all distinguishing badges from our uniforms in transport. It was valuable training in active service conditions, he said. If I find any of these female camp followers waiting for us at the other end, I'll know there's been a leakage. The smoke from the cookhouses drifted away in the mist, and the camp lay revealed as a planless maze of shortcuts superposed on the unfinished housing scheme, as though disinterred at a much later date by a party of archaeologists. The Pollock diggings provide a valuable link between the citizen-slave communities of the 20th century and the tribal anarchy which succeeded them. Here you see a people of advanced culture, capable of an elaborate draining system and the construction of permanent highways, overrun by a race of the lowest type. The measure of the newcomers may be taken by the facts that their women were devoid of all personal adornment, and that the dead were removed to a burying place, a great distance from the settlement, a sure sign of primitive taboo. Thus, I thought, the pundits of the future might write, and turning away I greeted the company sergeant-major. Has Mr. Hooper been round?" "Haven't seen him at all this morning, sir." We went to the dismantled company office, where I found the window newly broken since the barrack damages book was completed. "Wind in the night, sir," said the sergeant major. All breakages were thus attributable, or to "Sappers' demonstration, sir." Hooper appeared. He was a sallow youth, with hair combed back, without parting from his forehead, and a flat, Midland accent. He had been in the company 2 months. The troops did not like Hooper because he knew too little about his work, and would sometimes address them individually as George at stand-easies. But I had a feeling which almost amounted to affection for him, largely by reason of an incident on his first evening in the mess. The new colonel had been with us less than a week at that time, and we had not yet taken his measure. He had been standing rounds of gin in the ante-room, and was slightly boisterous when he first took notice of Hooper. "That young officer one of yours, isn't he, Ryder?" he said to me. "His hair wants cutting." "It does, sir," I said. It did. "I'll see that it's done." The colonel drank more gin, and began to stare at Hooper, saying audibly, "My God, the officers they send us now!" Hooper seemed to obsess the colonel that evening. After dinner, he suddenly said very loudly, "In my late regiment, if a young officer turned up like that, the other subalterns would bloody well have cut his hair for him." No one showed any enthusiasm for this sport, and our lack of response seemed to inflame the colonel. "You," he said, turning to a decent boy in A Company, "go and get a pair of scissors and cut that young officer's hair for him." "Is that an order, sir?" "It's your commanding officer's wish, and that's the best kind of order I know." "Very good, sir." And so, in an atmosphere of chilly embarrassment, Hooper sat in a chair while a few snips were made at the back of his head. At the beginning of the operation I left the ante-room, and later apologized to Hooper for his reception. "It's not the sort of thing that usually happens in this regiment," I said. "Oh, no hard feelings," said Hooper. "I can take a bit of sport." Hooper had no illusions about the army, or rather, no special illusions distinguishable from the general enveloping fog from which he observed the universe. He had come to it reluctantly, under compulsion, after he had made every feeble effort in his power to obtain deferment. He accepted it, he said, like the measles. Hooper was no romantic. He had not, as a child, ridden with Rupert's horse, or sat among the campfires at Xanthus' side. At the age when my eyes were dry to all save poetry, that stoic red-skin interlude where our schools introduce between the fast-flowing tears of the child and the man, Hooper had wept often, but never for Henry's speech on St. Crispin's Day, nor for the epitaph at Thermopylae. The history they taught him had a few battles in it, but, instead, a profusion of detail about humane legislation and recent industrial change. Gallipoli, Balaclava, Quebec, Lepanto, Bannockburn, Roncesvalles, and Marathon. These, and the battle in the West where Arthur fell, and 100 such names, whose trumpet notes even now in my sere and lawless state called to me irresistibly across the intervening years with all the clarity and strength of boyhood, sounded in vain to Hooper. He seldom complained. Though himself a man to whom one could not confidently entrust the simplest duty, he had an overmastering regard for efficiency, and drawing on his modest commercial experience, he would sometimes say of the ways of the army in pay and supply and the use of man-hours, "They couldn't get away with that in business." He slept sound, while I lay awake fretting. In the weeks we were together, Hooper became a symbol to me of young England, so that whenever I read some public utterance proclaiming what youth demanded in the future, and what the world owed to youth, I would test these general statements by substituting Hooper, and seeing if they still seemed so plausible. Thus, in the dark hour before Réveillé, I sometimes pondered, Hooper rallies, Hooper hostels, International Hooper Cooperation, and the religion of Hooper. He was the acid test of all these alloys.